Hi there. My name is Matt, and we're going to learn a little bit about chess today. And so I am going to show you a few things about the pieces and how they work, and then a little bit about each one. And so let's go ahead and jump in. So the first thing I want to show you is the most valuable piece on the board, and that is the king. And so hopefully you can see that there. So the king usually has um, a nice little crown on his head, a cross, if you will. And so he's the most important piece on the board. And so the game really centers around keeping your king safe and attacking the other player's king. And so that's really kind of what the whole game is about. And so then the next piece I'd like to introduce you to would be the queen. And the queen is generally the second tallest piece on the board. So I'll try to put these side by side there. And you can see the queen is just a little shorter than the king, and she doesn't have that nice tall crown on top. But she is the most powerful piece on the board. And so while the king is the most valuable in that the whole game revolves around keeping him safe, the queen is the most powerful piece on the board. And we'll learn a little bit later on about how all these pieces work and how they move and so forth. But for now, the queen is super powerful. The next piece I want to tell you about is the rook. And here's the rook. And the rook is sort of looks like a castle tower. And so that is a good description of the rook. It's not the tallest piece on the board, but it is pretty powerful. And it's a very strong piece, and one you'll want to learn a lot about and about how to use. And so there is the rook. And then the next piece I'll share with you about is this guy, and he's the bishop. And so the bishop has somewhat of a little point on top, so it's kind of goes into a bit of a point, and he's not quite as powerful as the rook, but is still a very powerful piece and very important piece in the game. And we'll learn more about the rook, or sorry, about the bishop as we move forward. So there's the bishop. Next up is this guy, the knight. And so I'll bring him closer there. Hopefully you can see the knight is looks like a horse, right? And which is pretty appropriate because usually knights would ride horses, right? And so he is a strong piece, and he's a little bit tricky. Has some interesting ways of moving around the board, which we'll talk about later on. But the knight is a very important piece, a very creative, let's say, piece, and a piece you'll want to learn about. A little bit challenging to get used to the knight and how he moves around the board, but certainly a very strong and important piece. And then last but not least is the pawn. And so he's kind of short, probably the shortest piece on the board usually, and he has a lot of friends. So usually at the beginning of the game, there are 16 total pieces for each side, and 8 of those pieces are this guy, the pawn. And so about half of the pieces on the board for you when you first start a game will be your pawns. And they're very important, very key to learn about in the game. And they have a little bit of a secret that I'll tell you about a little bit later on. And that it's a very important little secret. And if you're paying very close attention, you might be able to guess what that secret is. And so, but we'll talk more about the pawn as we go on. And so that's really it. Those are the pieces, 6 pieces on the board, 6 different kinds of pieces. The most valuable piece, the king, the most powerful piece, the queen. Then we have the rook, the bishop, that tricky knight, and then finally the pawn. So hopefully you've learned a little bit about the pieces, and as we go forward in lessons, we'll learn about how they move, how they work together to help you win the game of chess. So looking forward to talking to you more about the game, and see you next time.